Okay, let's move up the scale now for things that have carbon footprint of 1 to 10 kilos or 2.2 pounds to 22 pounds, starting with a paperback book. 400 grams CO2 equivalent is associated with a book that is about, I don't know how many grams, 250 grams, I think. Recycled paper with every copy printed getting sold. We will see what this means in a second. It could be 1 kilogram CO2 equivalent average book that you would find without worrying about what kind of a paper it was used and whether every copy was sold, whether it's hard, well, we're still with paperback. It jumps to 2 kilograms CO2 equivalent if the same book is on thick virgin paper with half the copies getting pulped. Okay, why does the number of copies matter? Because there is something called economy of scale that we will see. But first I want to make this point about whether it is better to buy a book that is printed on a paper, or even if it's recycled paper and every copy is sold, or is it better to buy ebooks? Okay, just doing numbers based on carbon footprint, it's not so easy to decide by looking at these numbers and then, by looking at these numbers and trying to say what is better or what is worse. But just if you do it as a carbon calculation, this says carbon footprint of a typical paperback is about the same as watching 12 hours of programs on an average, which means that if you're reading a book, you are probably not burning as much carbon as you would if you're doing other things like watching TV, driving around, eating, drinking, whatever. Okay, so not always easy to compare, but nonetheless they do matter, right? How much you read. But is ebook better or a paperback is a paper book is better? So here is the number of university textbooks which typically tend to be hardbound. Not sure if they're on virgin paper or recycled paper, but many of them have very glossy chemical with figures that have to look very good. And you can look at the US ebooks, 100% for book reading. US ebooks used for 50% for book reading. US ebooks used 75% for book reading, and so on. So just various parameters considered here. If you look at paper books minimum and maximum, that's the range in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and on average it is somewhere here. So the scale of economy here is that if there are lots of textbooks sold, then printing of paper copies begins to jump above the ebooks. But if there is a limited number of books being bought by students, then the paper copies may be better. This already complicates things. Why are we talking about the number of books? Because there is something called economies of scale. It just means an economic term that describes a competitive advantage that large entities have over smaller entities. This is in a business sense, but it is about reducing the cost of per unit manufacturing of something, in this case let's say the book. Okay, so manufacturing costs can fall by 70% to 90% every time a business doubles its output. So if you're a mom and pop store or a printer who's printing few books, whereas some massive producer like Barnes and Noble or whoever else comes along and produces 1,000,000 copies or 10,000 copies as opposed to your 100 copies, then there is an economy of scale. So cost per unit can drop as the quantity of units increases. Of course, then you can have diseconomies of scale if a company becomes less efficient as the number of units produced goes up. And there are other details. Internal, the sheer size of the company allows it to buy things in bulk bulk, which tends to drop the price. Externally speaking, receiving preferentially treatment from government or other external sources. So you know that there is a constant battle between retail bookshops versus Amazon, which disrupted the whole business, and individual authors that are trying to sell books versus selling on Amazon. So the Amazon business models add all kinds of other external factors, including how they are transported, even though now everybody is making noise about zero carbon packaging, electric vehicles, reducing transportation costs, and so on. But large shipping companies can use ships that carry as many goods as 16 freight trains. And it turns out that transporting things by train and road are always much more expensive than shipping by water with an actual ship. So, for example, we'll talk about wine in a minute, but a New Yorker may be better off in terms of carbon footprint buying European wine being shipped by cargo than being driven from California, a wine that is coming by truck or train. So these kind of calculations are there. But going back to the book, e-reader, for example, can allow you to carry your entire library in a tablet, and it generally increases the reading habits as well. Definitely worked for me. I used to travel with a suitcase full of books and papers, but now I just carry everything on a tablet. But each time you use the tablet, you are burning energy as well. So you have to always be careful about where the economies of scale are. But if I read more books, obviously I begin to have an advantage over paper books, and definitely I have increased my reading enough to more than compensate for the carbon footprint difference between a paperback and a tablet. Okay, so these are the kind of details we have to worry about. I will leave the loaf of bread for the next podcast because there are some nice points to be made there as well. Bread, obviously, everybody loves, at least I love, and Mediterranean food always includes a lot of bread. But the external factors now playing into it are that number of people with type 2 diabetes has gone up, and countries like China and India are now diabetes capitals. A lot of people with obesity and diabetes problems. Breads are often considered too high in carbohydrate, and unless they are multigrain, etc., they can also be hyperglycemic or release sugar too fast and create all kinds of problems. But we'll see that there are other very specific issues associated with breads and grains in general that we have to worry about. So we are now in the 1 kg to 10 kg category, so we have a few more interesting items to look at. Even though the title here is Book, Bread, Wine and Plastic, I'll come back and do the bread, wine and plastic separately. Okay. I should mention here, I mentioned economies of scale and didn't quite complete the thought. So the opening of the podcast said books printed versus sold. So economies of scale actually makes the publishers publish a lot of units in the first edition with the hope that they will get sold. Because the economies of scale is such that it's cheaper to produce a certain number of copies, and then they are shipped around. Of course, we are not talking about all those costs, but even when economies of scale help to reduce the per unit cost of the book, if they are not sold, then they have to be recycled, pulped back, etc. They are tried to be sold on sale, reduced price, etc., etc., but you can eventually end up with lots of unsold books which are recycled or somehow they are put back into the system. So that is what we have to worry about when we talk about printed paper books that are not sold in full number as printed. Okay, so that adds to the carbon footprint as well.